Welcome to Cutting with the Chase with Rob Chase, brought to you by the Inland Northwest Report.com. Alternative news and opinion for the Inland Northwest. And now, here's your host, Rob Chase.
This is Rob Chase with Cutting to the Chase, brought to you by the Inland Northwest Report.com. Today our guest is Bob Launhardt, safety engineer at the Sunshine Mine of 1972, when they had the fire. And it's apropos because tomorrow is the 47th anniversary of the fire, so we're going to revisit the fire with a couple of experts on it. Bob actually was safety engineer and lived through the experience. And Dr. Keith Russ is from Cornwall in England. He's a mining engineer, so go ahead and take it away, Dr.
Right.
Keith.
Thank you. This is Keith Russ, and I'm going to have a quiet chat with Bob regarding the use of the polyurethane foam that was found in the Sunshine Mine. I have experience underground myself of the use of foam, and I understand that this was perhaps a major contributing factor to the actual fire that you had. Would you like to sort of mention anything about the use of the foam and why it was used?
Well, in the first place, the major factor, preponderance of the evidence that we put together, that is Sunshine Management, from the time of the fire until the time of litigation. The trial over the fire took place in Boise, Idaho, starting in January of '78, and it ended on July the 16th. The fire was in '72, so we had about, 6 years, and during those years, evidence came to my attention that convinced me beyond a shadow of a doubt that had polyurethane not been involved in the initial fire, we would have had no fatalities. Now, Sunshine had a number of most of the fires, believe it or not, were caused by people using cutting torches and then walking off and not adequately soaking everything down. So they get hot metal on track ties and it smolders and it finally starts burning. Well, you have smoke, but that mine was evacuated probably a half a dozen times in the last 10 years before the fire. No one ever had to walk through heavy smoke. It was just part of the game. Mm-hmm. But with polyurethane, testing that was performed in England in 1976 established polyurethane puts out basically 10 times as much carbon monoxide as wood, and it puts out enough hydrogen cyanide to disable a person. But without the polyurethane, matter of fact, the judge, in his verdict at the end of the mine fire trial, said, Sunshine Mining Company has established that the polyurethane foam contributed to the death of 91 men. However, they have not proved beyond a reasonable doubt that, but for the presence of polyurethane foam, there would have been no fatalities. Therefore, I must rule in favor of the U.S. government and Mine Safety Appliance Company.
Mm. But surely the foam somewhere before the foam could have been used. Was there any testing done to prove that it wasn't likely to be a fire hazard?
Well, the product was certified by the Bureau of Mines as non-burning and self-extinguishing based on ASTM testing. I can't remember the number of the test. What was not known, the product performed exactly as was stated. It was non-burning and self-extinguishing in the basic test. However, it was never tested in a full-scale application.
So effectively what we're saying is, a lab test proved that it wouldn't burn, but once you put it into the real environment and you use it for the purposes that the mine then uses it, then you've got a different set of circumstances which perhaps then contribute to the possibility that it can then behave differently.
Well, the big thing is what was learned by Bureau of Mines testing. It was introduced into mines in the United States in 19 61, 62. In 1966, a Bureau of Mines team of 3, led by Donald W. Mitchell, who was the head of the fire section, they did testing of their own, and what they found was that you could put the foam on what we call the back in a hard rock, they call it the roof in a coal mine, and put it on the ribs or walls. And as long as you don't put it on multiple surfaces, it's safe. But if you put it on multiple surfaces, then with radiant heat from the fire, gases are emitted, and on multiple surfaces, it will predictably burn. It burned in every test. So that's kind of the situation in a nutshell.
But from my experience in mining, and the sort of from a ventilation point of view, where we've used what we would call expanding foam to seal areas or whatever off. You tend not to put them on one surface. You tend to sort of, if you have a doorway or something like that, then the foam is then all the way around. So you are introducing, like you mentioned, almost the arching effect to it. So you are giving perhaps two or at least two, maybe 3 surfaces that have foam on them.
Well, you described very accurately the circumstances in the sunshine. In the reconstruction of a ventilation system to accommodate sinking a main shaft, a new ventilation system was established. And one of the old working levels, the number of the level doesn't really matter, but it was used as a main circuit for the exhaust airway. 2 150 horsepower ventilation fans were installed upwind from an area that had been mined. 2 different vein structures that had been mined above and below the main drift or tunnel, which now is used for exhaust. So what Sunshine did is they lined up timbers through that section, made a nice smooth surface, or straight line timber, using 2x4 furring strips. They nailed 3/4 inch plywood panels on. Initially they tried to seal with oakum and mastic, but it still leaked like a sieve. So they bought equipment and they lined about 100 feet, 80 to 100 feet of the main exhaust from, well, actually starting at the rails and going all the way around, a full diameter. So yeah, we had a nice, very flammable tunnel.
I mean, I've having read a bit about the fire, and another part of my job capacity, I'm one of the team captains of our mines rescue team. So we have been taught a bit about smoke and all the rest of it. One of the things I did read was we mentioned about ventilation, and it seemed to me from what I read that the way the ventilation system in Sunshine was operating, that if you did have an incident like the one that happened in 1972, you are almost, it seemed to me that the fans were then going to recirculate the air around the workings, which then you were effectively poisoning everything in one go, making it certainly more difficult for perhaps people to escape. Is that the correct understanding I have?
Absolutely. It kind of comes down to this. Those fans were located maybe 500 feet from the number 10 shaft, which was the number. Okay, I have to describe a little bit about the ore deposit in the Sunshine. It dips to the south and it strikes to the east. So with surface mining, it's right close to the main shaft. By the time we got down to 3,700 foot level, that's 3,700 feet below the surface, the main ore body was essentially a mile east of the main shaft. So the number 10 shaft is a mile east of the main shaft. So anyway, with depth and long passageways to move the air in and out, it takes a lot of horsepower. So to make that system work, they had to find or drive new airways or use old passageways that, that could be adapted. Well, in this case, the weak link in the whole exhaust system was on 3400 level between number 10 shaft and out toward the Joule shaft. It had been mined. So that area was smooth lined and timbered, but even with the description that I gave you before, with the mastic and the oakum, it was leaking like a sieve, so the polyurethane was used. Okay, what we have then is we have an area below those exhaust fans, and they worked under about 14 inches of water gauge, which you will understand. When the fire broke out on that bulkhead, with the polyurethane burning, it didn't take but a few minutes before the bulkhead was weakened enough that it collapsed under the pressure. And now all of the combustion wants to go back to the intake side of the fan and go around in circles. So what it did, in fact, it put the whole active mining system, it put it into a recirculation, except for the area where those two people survived. They were in another ventilation circuit that had just been established, totally independent of this recirculating system.
So, I mean, another issue that having read about the fire was the fact that on the day of the fire we've got a lot of the top management off-site at a meeting. So you've got people underground who may have been in a supervisory capacity, but they didn't necessarily know they had the power to to turn the fans off. Because you might say, if the fans had been turned off earlier rather than later, you might have stopped a lot of the recirculating from happening. But if someone doesn't know they've got the authority to do it, I know from our experience in the UK, shift bosses and other people are reluctant to use their authority if they rather than say perhaps wait for somebody higher up the chain to say, right, do this. I mean, do you feel that if somebody on site that morning, once the fire had been discovered, had switched the fans off earlier, would that have had a positive effect on things, or would it have been by that stage? You might say the chain of disaster had started, and the fact that stopping the fans might not have prevented what happened.
Well, I did a complete review of the ventilation system in my investigation. To answer your question, had those fans been turned off the minute that the big explosion occurred, if you want to call it that, the explosion of smoke through the fire zone and back into the intake airway, most of the men could have escaped, probably would have. But the assumption that if the general manager or the mine manager had been there, or the mine superintendent, they would have known immediately what needed to be done, and they would have ordered the fans shut off and nobody would have died. Well, the people best able to make the decision were the people who were in the mine. So we had two men who were area foremen. We had the transportation foreman. The people that were in the mine had intimate knowledge. The people that were at the stockholders meeting, the new mine manager had been there for about 3 months, and he'd been in the mine, but there's no way you can learn a complicated mine. The mine superintendent, who had been there for probably, I'm going to say maybe 5 years, Charlie Hathorn, was terminated by Tom McManus, and they hired a new mine superintendent who was very experienced over in Montana, but he did not know the mine. Now, had I stayed underground that morning, I would have known what to do, but I was underground that morning to do a quick inspection. I had to write a new safety manual that week for a safety meeting on Friday, but I would have known immediately that we had a short circuit, but the people who were there didn't have a clue.
Right.
And the people that were there were criticized for taking time to try to determine where the fire was located so they would know which of 3 exit routes would be safest to use. Nobody knew where it was. The smoke was coming out of an inactive part of the mine. The fans were located in an inactive part of the mine. So God himself alone would have known.
Well, perhaps now we sort of mentioned your trip underground. First thing, perhaps we just sort of you'd like to describe how did your day go? You know, what was a normal day, or a day like for you when you going into the mine on a.
Well, I would go underground about 4 days a week. In this particular case, I was kind of under the gun to write a new safety manual for the meeting on Friday. We had a development supervisor who was supervising the crews in the bottom 2 levels of the mine. So we went in ahead of the crew, did a complete inspection, including all the safety equipment, and I was back out of the mine and in my office opening my dinner bucket for lunch when I got calls to bring the mine rescue apparatus into the mine. So that was my day. Yeah.
It's one of those hypothetical questions. I think this is, isn't it? Hindsight is a wonderful thing. The question I've written down here is: would you have done anything different that day? And the answer probably is, unless you knew the fire was going to happen, you probably say you wouldn't. You know, but do you think there's anything that could have prevented the fire from occurring? In terms of, we have procedures now, I know at the mine I work at, for where people can burn, or, so you're very proactive in where people can use naked flames or sources of ignition, so you don't go cutting next to a diesel store or something like that. So is there anything procedure-wise that the mine could have used to sort of reduce the likelihood of fire underground?
Well, I have to qualify my comments. At the time of the fire, nobody in the underground mining industry in the United States thought that polyurethane could burn. Matter of fact, we were convinced that it would not burn. And matter of fact, there was one article published promoting it by Mine Safety Appliance Corporation, indicating that you can use this product to fight mine fires because it won't burn. And maybe I should try to find that information and forward it to you. So, but in retrospect, had I known, or had anyone known that this product could burn, they would not have sent a crew in there with cutting torches, people who were smoking, to work in the heart of that mine ventilation system. So I'm not sure that that's what you were trying to determine, but hindsight, is different.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned perhaps earlier, the chain of what we call in the UK the chain of catastrophe. You think it's not necessarily the use of foam, because the inspectorate have decided that foam won't burn, but you've got a combination now of the people smoking underground and using burning equipment,
Right.
that on their own isn't going to start the fire necessarily, but it's just it's a set of unfortunate circumstances, isn't it? Here that a lack of knowledge that given a particular set of circumstances on a particular day, and that is what those combination of things, a guy's using cutting kit perhaps, or smoking, and the use of the foam, led to what happened afterwards. I mean, it's never, in all the, I would say, the inquiries into various accidents or disasters that I've read as part of my work, it's never one simple event that leads to a disaster. It's always a combination of, and the problem is, like you've mentioned, you're not necessarily aware that during a period of time you have passed through one of those, there is a link that's part of this chain, and you pass through it without necessarily knowing it. The use of the foam and the fact that people said it didn't burn is just one of those links.
I'd like to comment on that. As part of the investigative work that I've done within the last 6 months, once I found a source of detailed information, that all of the details were recorded by Bureau of Mines personnel. A book written by James M. Day, who was solicitor for the Bureau of Mines, he was a recipient. He said in his book he had 4 file drawers full of data, and it was in his office for 30 years. And he finally decided it was time to put that into writing. Okay, so, but his book, it had information that was, we were never privy to that. I mean, as a litigant against the government, under the discovery process, they had to produce documents, but this was never written until 2007. I didn't know the book was out there. I found out about it about 1.5 years ago from one of the local newspaper guys, and he says, but you don't want to read it. Oh, well, that means I gotta buy it.
Oh yes, you got to.
Anyway, here's what it comes down to. The record of time of the crew that took the cutting torch from 3,700 level up to 3,400 level, went in, did their work, went back, and considering the location of the area where they did the cutting and burning in a heavily timbered area, and using other data prepared by, I think it could have been British, it could have been U.S. Bureau of Mines type people, where they know the progression rate of a timber fire. I calculated that if they were in this area at 10 o'clock and the fire first broke out at 11:40, it would take that period of time for that fire to work its way up to the area where the polyurethane lined structure was located. So in that regard, reconstructing, there's no doubt in my mind that the fire started where they did the work, and once it hit the polyurethane, it's like solid gasoline.
I have read somewhere that the UK Mines Inspectorate had actually banned the use of polyurethane foam in coal mines, because I think they discovered that, given the correct circumstances, you could have a conflagration underground, and that's the last thing you need is naked flames in the coal mine.
There's some history on that.
But it does seem to me to be sort of unbelievable, really, that the information available in our little island, to say from our mines inspectorate in the use of foam and its potential, the potential for fire wasn't then passed on to the US Bureau of Mines to say, hang on, we found this, you ought to know about it.
Well, you'll be interested in this. In 1969, there was a polyurethane foam fire in a British coal mine, a long section that had been sealed to prevent leakage of methane into the main part of the mine. No one was in the mine, but it burned, and it was non-burning and self-extinguishing. The British went back to the manufacturer, they got the formula, and the people in Buxton manufactured, they wanted to make sure everything was according to specs, and they tested that same section, and it burned. So they notified the United States Bureau of Mines. They notified Donald W. Mitchell. For reasons only God will know, he's dead. He never shared that information with anybody initially. But he and his 2 partners, there were 3 of them that worked on this, testing the product in 1966. But here we've got 1969, we had a fire. That's the only fire. Well, you can imagine their logic. This product is in place in thousands of mines, United States, worldwide. There's never been a fire before. There'll probably never be another fire. So, but the knowledge was there, and it was shared, and it was not, the Bureau top man knew it, but he chose not to share it.
For reasons, unfortunately, we'll never know.
Well, we can speculate. I have to add one thing. The Bureau of Mines was asked by the mining industry, this was back in the 1930s and early 40s, the Bureau of Mines their assignment initially was to improve safety and health in underground mines. They were asked to find something besides concrete blocks or cinder blocks to build walls, to basically seal where you have to seal against combustible or explosive gases, like coal mines.
Mm-hmm.
They developed polyurethane foam. So it was a joint effort between the Bureau of Mines and Mine Safety Appliance Corporation. They developed the product. They tested the product. They came to our mine in 1961, a Bureau of Mines rep out of Seattle and an MSA rep out of wherever, and they demonstrated the product. We bought it. The big mines all bought that equipment. So it's not like it's something that just came out of the woodwork. Actually, if it performed universally as well as it did in the ASTM test, there would never have been a sunshine fire or a fire in Kinross in 86, excuse me.
I mean, one thing I have read, and we've sort of touched on, the speed at which the foam actually burns. And I mean, I think I've read somewhere about, a timber tunnel will burn at a given speed, but a foam field fire burns at something considerably faster. And that in my view, it's that increase in the speed which probably played a major part, because your colleagues, although they're going around looking for whether the source of the fire, but if you're in a timbered mine, you think, well, we might have X amount of time because we know that the timber work will burn slowly. But if the foam is alight, then that time window that a lot of people thought they might have is now a lot smaller, isn't it? It's gone. Because essentially, if you think, okay, it might take several minutes for it to burn along the section of timber tunnel that caught fire, but if it's now full of foam, that time then is now maybe not 10-15 minutes, it may only be a minute. And so your colleagues underground now have got confronted with something that they have no experience of.
Right. Are you familiar with Roberts and Blackwell's work on fuel-rich fires?
I've read a small amount, but not a great deal.
The reason that I ask, Graham Wild, who was head of the Bureau of Mines research, fire test research mining in Buxton, was one of the experts that the Sunshine Mining Company hired to help us. And after he had reviewed all of my notes, and this was just shortly before the trial in 1978, he said this. He said he had participated in in laboratory type testing, small scale testing, with fuel-rich fires, but he said there had never been a case where a fuel-rich fire was identified in a mine fire. However, he said he was convinced from what I had been able to find, this was back in 1977, the trial was 70, he was convinced that was a fuel-rich fire during its first few hours, and there's strong evidence of that, but that's another story. But the flame spread on polyurethane is up to 100 times as fast as it is on a wood fire. Can be that fast.
Which is, from an underground point of view, that's quite frightening. Because now you're confronted with something that's certainly moving faster than you can move.
Faster than you can run. Yeah.
And coupled with that, that's producing an awful lot of noxious products, which now you've not only are they being produced, you've got a ventilation system now which is unfortunately recirculating those around in an equally quick speed. Do you think the inspectorate, or I'm going to call it the inspectorate, which is what I would say the UK would use, have any part? Did they inadvertently have have a hand in what actually happened? I mean, we are bound by our inspectorate to use products that are certified or whatever for the various jobs that we need to do. So I do wonder, having read the material you've written and others have written, that you get a feeling that somewhere along the lines the US Bureau of Mines are. I'm not quite sure what the phrase I'm looking for here. Perhaps they have a hand in the cause, perhaps more than they'd perhaps like to think they have.
There's an interesting feature here. I can't speak for coal mines, and of course that's a whole different ballgame. But in hard rock mines, the Bureau of Mines was there in an advisory capacity, but they couldn't come into a mine and say, tear this down, build this. That was not part of their jurisdiction. The only authority they had was, in the case of Sunshine, when the fire once it got going, they came in and they officially closed the mine to all mining activity. But before the Sunshine, and going back as far as I could go, they left it up to the state mine inspectors. Each state had its own. Idaho had a mine inspector. The state had authority to punish or to close a mine if necessary. I'm not sure that they had the authority, that they assessed monetary fines, but the Bureau of Mines did not have that. They were not responsible for enforcement.
Okay. I mean, we have the UK Mines Inspectorate. We don't have a county by county system, which would, I suppose, might equate to the state by state in the UK. We have one set of mine inspectors who cover every county. So, and most of our inspectorate are ex-coal board mine managers. So they've done their training, and they all have the relevant tickets. So we are under their capacity to say, right, now they can come in any time they like, pay a visit. They have warrant cards if necessary to close us down and stick notices on. So I think we are well governed, in the UK, on what we can and can't do. But it's very difficult sometimes to look at thinking the way the world's gone and say, we're living in 2019, and then trying to sort of say, yes, but this is what the regulatory and this is the circumstances that people were working under back in 1972, and it's a very different world to the world we're living in. So it's sometimes you can't say, well, why did that happen then? Because it wouldn't happen now. And the answer simply is, well, the regulations have changed. People have learned, health and safety is perhaps a different culture now, especially in mines, than it was 50, 60 years ago. We have a book that we work with called the Mines and Quarries Act. It's a government publication. It came in 1956. It replaced a number of other mine acts, and effectively it's a book written in the blood of a large number of coal miners, so we know that every regulation and every use of electricity or burning kit or electric locos or anything, it's all governed, and therefore they say this is the regulations and we work to it. I found it very interesting that in one of the books, it might have been, I don't know if it was James Day's or The Deep Dark or one of those, where it mentioned the Selfrescuers, and I have trouble, even in a modern capacity, trying to encourage our workforce to undertake training in the use of We all have to wear them. The mine inspector has deemed that we will wear them. I found it interesting, perhaps you may like to comment on this, that back in 1972 I found it interesting that they had to be used in coal mines in the US, but not necessarily in metal mines. And you think that does seem mining. You think that the mining world would say, well, if it's good to work in one mine, it should be good enough to work in another.
Well, there's an interesting thing there, and it goes back to the basic assumption that the Canadian Mining Journal spoke, that it would be impossible to have a dangerous fire in a non-coal mine unless it was in a shaft. So why did we have self-rescuers when none of the other underground mines had them? It was when I took over the safety job in 1961, in my mind I wanted to do everything I could to make the mine as safe as possible, knowing how scattered the mining working places were. I mean, in some places you might have to walk for 20 minutes or half an hour to get there. I could envision, say like a locomotive catches fire or something, I could envision a circumstance where people would have to walk through smoke to get into their escape way. So I talked to the mine superintendent. We bought, if we had 30 people on the level, we had 60 self-rescuers on the level. And we did this for the whole mine. The people said I was crazy. This is not won't use the word coal mine, this is a hard rock mine. You don't have fires in a hard rock mine. But we had them. Unfortunately, I left that mine in 1967. With, the management that we had then was very distasteful to me. I was asked to come back in December of '71. I got a phone call from the personnel manager, and he named the person, so-and-so's dead now. We need you back here. So I said never, but I came back on Valentine's Day in '72. The self-rescuer storage in the mine was a disaster. I mean, no one had taken care of it. But there's another element. The person who was managing safety had ordered a whole bunch of the new Bureau of Mines, MSA W65 self-rescuers. Those things were good. They were never delivered. Purchasing agent had a letter from MSA telling us that at that time they were replacing all of the old BM 1447s in the coal mines, and that we didn't need them. We were a hard rock mine, so the orders were never filled. But we didn't have enough self-rescuers on the mine for all the people that were working there, because people had carried them off. They found out they were good for spray painting cars, but you don't need them. So the bottom two levels of the mine didn't have any self-rescuers, and there was nothing we could do about it. So
in my mind, there's yet another link in this growing sort of list of the catastrophe as it happened. We have gone from the use of what we'll call the filter self-rescuers, which only filter out carbon monoxide. South Crofty as a mine had them in use until 1998 when it closed, and as a result of changes in legislation and the work of the mine inspectorate and what we've done at the mine, we now have oxygen generating self-rescuers, which now at least
self-contained.
They're self-contained. So it doesn't matter what gas is in the air, you have a breathing bag and a mask, and at least we say we have a fighting chance of getting out within 3/4 of an hour. I can understand, having sort of knowing the way the miners I've worked with behave, that we've got to carry this thing, I suppose you want us to carry it, but there's still this reluctance, well, okay, we'll carry it, but we don't necessarily believe we're ever going to need it. Therefore there's that reluctance to sort of be proactive in sort of like, I'd like to know how it works, or what do I do. Most miners aren't. They rather get on with the job And so the safety aspect, which the culture you try to install in people in your first visit, sort of doesn't really happen, does it? Because people will think, well, we're not going to have a fire. So if we're not going to have a fire, why do I need to know how to use it? Because I'm never going to need the circumstances are never going to happen that I'm ever going to need to use it. So I think luckily things have changed. I think there's definitely our deputy, our new assistant mine manager has worked he's only a youngster, he's in his mid-30s. He's been around the world and worked in other mines, and we were all instructed, you must be able to put your self-rescuer on and know how to put it on in under a minute, and we do it blindfolded. So everybody knows that if the worst comes to the worst, at least you can put it on, and it will save your life. Although I will add that one of my colleagues, the one I mentioned who was in the mine rescue team, said, I don't need to do the training, I know how to put one of these on, and anyway there won't be a fire underground, and the chances that in a Cornish mine there won't be a fire, and anyway we're not going to have people walking around in smoke. And I just turned around and said, I can't believe you're saying that. You know about sunshine, you know what happened, and if somebody can say in your mind it can't happen here, and it did, then it can happen anywhere. And I think it's really sad that people have to die in whatever mine before other people take the lessons from it and learn and say, right, we didn't think this could happen, but it did, and therefore we must learn for the future that think sunshine should be remembered as a watershed perhaps event where from this point onwards things will be done differently. It's a use of the foam, it's a use of self-rescuers, it's a combination of the ventilation network, it's a combination of a large number of things. But on one day in 1972, all conspired against you all. The one thing I've read from the book, is in spite of.
You started by.
There was a lot of, there were a lot of heroes. I get the feeling a lot of your colleagues, when confronted with something that was so out of their comfort zone, so out of their field of experience, because we have to, by law, have every year we have to have a full mine evacuation, for whatever reason. And I can safely say that we haven't, because trying to organise one as safety officer and trying to get the shift bosses to agree and everything, I want to take everybody out and just say, try it, doesn't happen, So, yeah, there was a conspiracy, not on perhaps the personnel, but the circumstances, and then when you got your colleagues working underground, having been confronted with a fire or an event they'd never come across before, the speed of the burning of the foam, the production of huge quantities of carbon monoxide, and I think I'm right in saying, Bob, that was it 2%, something like that you recorded?
From 3 to 7%, immediately downstream from our test in England.
It's just unbelievable.
0.3% is dangerous, in 30 minutes?
We're talking, we work, I think our electric meters go off at about 300 parts per million.
At 3%, if you took a couple breaths, you'd be dead.
And that really is quite a scary thought. One perhaps question we can move on to is there a continued use of the foam today? Are people still using, in spite of the now the knowledge that's been gained, is the foam still in use?
Well, I have friends working over in Montana, one of those big mines over, I can't say the name of it right now, but it's over close to Billings, and they're still installing polyurethane. However, they're using it like to seal around ventilation doors, but they're not putting it on long stretches of timbered ventilation bulkheads.
Right.
So I think the knowledge is there. You don't want to use it in a large scale application, but it's still being used.
I think we would. I can see the circumstances in the UK where, we would, especially for sealing sort of ventilation bulkheads or something on a localized. It's ideal for making a ventilation seal, but I can't think. Well, I think we are fortunate in the sense that I can't think there's circumstances where we would actually have maybe like 20, 30 or 40, maybe 100 feet of maybe sprayed everywhere, because I think our management would take the view, A, we don't need it, and B, it's expensive, so we might be careful in that. If you'd had more mine rescue personnel on the day present on the, in terms of breathing apparatus teams, do you think that would have made a difference to the numbers rescued, or by the time you assemble a rescue team and you go underground, you're now, as we mentioned earlier, you're confronted now by a fire that, when you got notified, was perhaps a small burning fire, and by the time you get underground, it's a completely different beast, isn't it?
Well, in a metal mine fire, the Magma Copper down in Superior, Arizona, had a fairly large timber fire some years ago, and this is written up by Bureau of Mines people, and they took over an hour to decide to evacuate the crew, and it took about 2 hours before they got everybody out from underground. That's a typical timber fire. So,
Yeah.
but if you had polyurethane foam involved,
you don't have 2 hours, do you?
There's an inside story here that might help you understand. There were 2 hoists at number 10 shaft. One of them could handle 12 men to a deck, 4 decks, 48 men at a time. That hoist never operated because the hoist room was, there's a conduit from carrying smoke from the inactive part of the mine where the fire started, and it took it right into his cab, and he was out next to the main haulage vomiting. He couldn't, so that hoist wasn't used. So they had to use the muck hoist, which had just 1 trailer deck. The first load that they hoisted, they unloaded on 3700 station. All they had to do was walk to the jewel shaft a mile away. Well, the way that recirculation occurred from the fire, it went from 3400 level down to 4000 level, back toward the main shaft about 1500 feet, and then it carried it back up into the intake airway. So that first bolus of smoke from polyurethane and wood flowed from number 5 shaft back into 10 shaft and killed every one of those people. The first ones hoisted. The rest were hoisted to 3100 level. And of the people who escaped the first 3 or 4 trips, they didn't get that first great big load, but there were still people collapsing. So anyway, that might help a little bit to get a mental image.
No, it seems to me, sort of from what I've read, it's the time. There's always this thing with any major event, they call it like the golden hour, and things happen. And your golden hour may not have been a golden hour. It may have been a much shorter span of time. And by the time I think there's a tipping point in all incidents, and once you've walked past that, the circumstances that follow it, the guys, no matter how brave and everybody was trying to rescue their colleagues, they're never going to get out because I think it's sort of like the window of opportunity, of getting out had closed, and I think it's just really sad. You know, I mean, we're lucky in the UK that we've never. I think because we don't use timber on a grand scale, because we don't have as many we don't have the wood underground for a start. We don't have trees on the surface to cut down. One of the local mines the Canadians bought into, and they said, right, we're going to do it like we do in Canada. We're going to fill everything with timber work, and they imported timber from Canada. And they soon stopped doing that because they discovered how expensive it was.
Oh.
So they went back to doing it, you might say, the Cornish way, which is you trying not to use timber as much as you can. You know, so you're trying to get it is a mess. It's a hard rock in that case.
Well, I'd like to throw in another example that you may or may not be aware of. But there was a mine in Chile, big underground mine. They had a fire that killed 365 men. It wasn't in the mine. And this is cold country. At the portal, they had a blacksmith shop and a machine shop and other things. Anyway, it was severe cold. There was a 5-gallon bucket of lubricant that they were going to use, and it was stiff. So they set it next to a forge, and then they went around the corner to smoke a cigarette and forgot about it, and it caught fire. And so the 5 gallons of petroleum product, it went right into the ventilation air, and it killed everybody in the mine.
That's scary.
Donald Mitchell, Graham Wild made this statement: there should be nothing more combustible in a mine than wood. So that rules, if you don't want to, like now, where they used to have mules in the mine and humans, now they've got rubber-tired LHDs, each carrying 30 to 50 gallons of diesel fuel and crankcase oil and rubber tires. Well, there was a fire in a mine in Arizona about a year and a half after Sunshine. A front-end loader that weighed 42 tons was mucking up out of a transfer chute into trucks that were taking it out of the mine. That transfer hung up, so they ran water in it to get it down. And when it came down, it came all at once. And it washed this big loader across the station up against a compressed air line. The line broke. This unit caught fire, and with all that compressed air blowing into the fire, the only thing that didn't burn were the exhaust valves. That's the only thing they found.
We've moved away from one source of problem, and by sort of mechanising our mines to the such of, you know, putting diesel vehicles underground, in some cases we've actually introduced a different hazard. You know, you might go away and say, well, we might have solved the use of the foam problem, which is one source of ignition. And what we've done, well, you put rubber-tired vehicles underground with diesel and hydraulic fluid, and we had an incident one evening where the fitters had overfilled one of the hydraulic tanks or something, or one of the old tanks on it, and so the breather tube for this part of the engine would fire the excess oil out, but due to a design fault, it was firing it. This spray of fine lubricant or fine oil was being fired over the exhaust manifold of the engine, and the driver. We're very fortunate that the one driver who was operating it that evening had the peace of mind and quick thinking. As soon as he saw the thing catch fire next to him, he hit the fire suppression equipment on board the thing and covered the whole thing in powder and put it out. Because if he had, where it was sitting in the exhaust airway at that stage, if it had gone up properly, then not only would we have had a burnt out truck, we'd have had all the timber. steel arching has got timber work between it and packed up with pallets and all sorts of foam and everything else to try and bridge the gap between the timber and the rock. And I'm in no doubt that if this truck had actually caught fire properly, we'd have had a right mess. You know?
Sure.
But I, as part of my training, we are continually informed that, in spite of what you think, you know, there are fires in metal mines, which don't burn, of course, you know, on a regular basis, because diesel-powered vehicles do catch fire. My instructor was in Australia end of last year, and he said, I'm there in a inspectorate capacity. He said I can act as a mine inspector in New South Wales. And he said the day before I was due to visit the mine, one of their 50-ton dump trucks did exactly that, and the driver just managed to steer it out of the way because he was heading towards a fuel store at the time, and although we had a burning truck, he managed to then decide, well, I'll drive it as far as I can somewhere else, so you know, to try and avoid that. The poor young lady who's on the level below, also driving a 50-ton truck, was confronted by a wall of smoke that was coming towards her down the decline towards her. She managed to park up, and she said in the testimony that I ran not thinking of putting my self-rescuer on because I saw the smoke coming towards me, and she said, and I ran as fast as my legs would carry me to the refuge station that they had underground, and once she got there she locked herself in, and she said I spent 24 hours in that while the smoke was cleared. So perhaps there's a point there that, you know, if like we have in modern mines, we're instructed now that sending a rescue team in to rescue all your colleagues is now looking a bit more frowned upon, then the use of safe havens, shall we say, is now becoming more popular. That perhaps rather than if you could turn the clock back to sort of 71 rather than 72 and say, right, if we know that a safe haven is a good, rather than evacuating the people from the mine, we can keep them somewhere underground safe until whatever event has stopped. You might turn around and say the guys would have survived.
We had a safe haven on 5600 level where the rock temperature is 128 degrees. How long would you want to stay in there?
Not very long.
The Lucky Friday mine, number 4 shaft, is down to 8,300 feet. The rock temperature is 150. Not like being in a coal mine.
No.
Yeah. So there's other things that have to be taken into consideration. Yeah.
I mean, we're
a safe haven.
Yeah, well, I think that they had a fire or an explosion underground in the Balby potash mine in the north of England, and I think they said the air temperature down there in places is up to between 50 and 65 degrees centigrade, you know. And there are a couple of refuges there, and I know the safety officer was very proud of one of the ones he put in because it was about as big as this room. It had enough oxygen and other and running water and all the sort of mod cons that you might want in a refuge. And he reckoned, in the event of a major fire underground, I think it would probably be a vehicle fire that would prevent people from getting out. I think everyone, he reckoned, could stay down there for, you know, a day or so. But I'm like you, the temperature you've mentioned. No, I think there comes a point where it might work on a bit of paper. Someone says, yeah, we'll put a refuge there in the event of. People can stay there for as long as it takes, but I think unless you actually have a practice, you know, where the workforce are informed, if in the event of this is where you're going to go, and you could spend a considerable period in time in there, some people might still decide I'd rather get out than stay underground, because it's only it's a natural human way we operate, isn't it? You know, you think, I don't want to stay close to where this incident is. I want to get away as far away as possible. And if you're underground, the safest place you can be is on the surface, isn't it? Now let's have a. I understand you're doing some research into the use of foam, and is there anything that you think you might uncover that will have a positive effect in the future?
Well, I would hope that sometime soon, the U.S. government would order all polyurethane foam removed, and if there are any large-scale applications. I mean, to me, that's just, it has to be very common sense. Going beyond that, though, there's no substitute for good planning. And you pointed to the fact sunshine ventilation was designed to fail in a short circuit, and it did. Well, if there were no highly toxic materials burning, it would just be hot and you have to get out.
Yeah.
But in this case, with polyurethane, it was a death trap. But if you believe it won't burn, and if then you don't plan for that event. So, by the way, Bureau of Mines, they established a technical support group in Denver. So this came after Mesa became MSHA. But the technical support people, they had ventilation engineers. They had people that were well trained in testing for mine gases or in testing for silica. Those people were available and they would come in and help. Those people were invaluable. But unfortunately, miners don't like to have somebody come in from outside and tell them how to do something. So you're going up against human nature.
I'm afraid to say that I'm not a Cornishman, but I'm not going to try and slate my Cornish friends here. But the Cornish have a very parochial view that hard rock mining, as they would see, started in Cornwall and was exported around the world, and because they would like to think they were the birthplace of hard rock mining all those years ago, they would say, right, if it was good enough for Father, it's good enough for us attitude. And the fact that someone else might come in from somewhere else and say, oh, have you thought about doing this? And the answer is, what do you know about it? We know best. And I think, and there's also there's this change thing, isn't there? I mean, I know human nature is I know I am, we don't like change, we like routine and things, and therefore we tend to think, well, okay, we could change that.
But like the average person in the United States, everybody thinks that they're above average driver. Everybody. I can drive better than most people.
I've seen some of that.
Statistically, that can't be.
No, we can't all be top of the tree. Unfortunately, there's going to be a spread that some are better than others, and I think in my short time in the country this time, I've certainly experienced that in rush hour going around some of the freeways in Portland. Trying to think of where we can go. I think mining will gradually sort of become more technologically advanced, and I think there certainly is now far more control. There's certainly more gas monitoring going in. There's far more telemetry, or whatever you want to call it, telemetry or whatever it is. So mines are far more sort of monitored than they've ever been. So with a view, I think that if it is monitored, if we do get an incident or something does happen, we get as much information as early as possible, so we can make an informed decision on what we might do next, whether that is sending people to safe havens or bringing them out. I think the problem with all mines 50, 60, 70 years ago is incidents happen, and it was, fires or accidents underground are unfortunately part of the job, and I think people sadly get sort of oblivious to the dangers sometimes, don't they? In the sense that I come to work every day, even if things are slightly dangerous. When I think when I started here, that looks dangerous, but over a period of time you get used to the danger, and therefore you think the risk is reduced. And I mean, I think you could say the same with the foam here, where we started. The fact that it was introduced and you didn't have a fire straight away only reinforces the fact that if you're told that it's not going to burn, and we haven't had anything for 10 years, there's a good chance that we might not have it might not happen at all. Unfortunately, human life and incidents do have a method of catching us up.
True.
Right, I think we've reached a suitable point to end. I'd like to thank Bob very much for having a quiet chat, and wish you all well.
Great.
My
Thanks.
privilege.
Good job. I probably would have ended, as you can go back, but did you have anything else you wanted to add, Bob, or are you talked out, or?
Excuse
Oh,
me?
I was going to say, a final question probably would have been, is there anything else you would like to add to the?
Oh, that's fine. That's,
Yeah, okay. Great, no, great show. I think it was great.
I mean,
And you've got a lot, as you got in, just like a few minutes, you were right into just
Yeah.
like two guys talking, so.
We had something I will mention. We had a lady come to our mine who was going to invest in it, and she worked for a company in New York called Liberty Mines and Metals, and she had, like I was told, she had $2 billion in her pocket that she could spend.
Oh, okay.
And that this was 20.
Why bother? Go somewhere and enjoy it.
Yeah.
Well, by the sound of it, she certainly did enjoy whatever they were paying her, and she came up to. We sat at the table over lunch discussing mines and everything, and she said, "Oh, we've invested in somewhere else. You may have heard of it.
Yeah.
We've just bought a silver mine."
Oh,
And I went, "Oh yes," and she said, "Yeah, you might like if things go forward and ever, you might like a trip round it." And I went, and already my mind going, I think I know where this is going. And she said, "Oh yes, it's called the Sunshine in Idaho." And I said, I'm not entirely sure that going on what you might describe as, we would describe in the UK as a jolly, knowing what happened, whether sort of walking down various levels, I just feel it was like, no, this is a bit more than my I'm going to be able to stomach. I think it's.
well, I think Sunshine last time sold for 24 million.
They're trying to reopen again, aren't they?
Yeah. If you're,
The truth is, from what Harry Coffer told me, Harry's a geologist, might be a geological engineer, and he was Sunshine's general manager.
yeah.
At today's silver price, there's as much silver to be mined in the Sunshine Mine as was mined. Most of the time, silver was somewhere between 20 cents
Yeah.
and then 20 to $1. But when you have a vein of a certain width and you've got so many ounces to the ton, and the vein narrows down, you get to a point where it's no longer economical
Yeah.
to mine that. So they leave it, and this is all mapped out. So what they're going to do now, they're going to start out on the surface. Now there's, the Blake brothers found one vein, and others picked up one or two. But with all the diamond drilling, there's LHDs. They can ramp down and mine, and the mining costs are going to be much lower. And if they someday, it all depends on supply and demand.
Oh, it always is.
They could very well go back and remine everything that they mined before. Just go back and pick up what they
Well,
left.
the upper levels, I mean, they could probably start at the top and go work their way back down again.
We're doing.
This has been Cutting to the Chase with Rob Chase, where we cover anything under the sun that would be of interest to you, our viewers. Cutting to the Chase has been brought to you by the Inland Northwest Report.com, alternative news and opinion for the Inland Northwest. Don't forget to catch our Sunday edition of Cutting to the Chase, where Rob will interview local pastors on Christian perspectives. Until next time, stay in prayer for God, family, and country.